Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam, and we're the co-founders of Senko Matcha Products.
We launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today's episode, we want to give it a comprehensive review of what matcha was in the past, what it is nowadays, and what it could be in the future. I feel like that there are already 1,000 articles and podcasts online talking about the history of matcha. And, Ryan, let's, try to create something new, I guess, for our audience that's a little bit more refreshing.
Yeah, you're totally right. And, both you and I tend to be a little more reserved about covering topics that a lot of other people have, just simply because there's so much good information out there. How do we put a unique spin on it? But I do think it's worthwhile, at least in the Specialty Matcha podcast, to have at least one episode dedicated to the history of matcha. Certainly not a comprehensive one, which cannot be done in any reasonable length of time.
I'm ready for a 2-hour recording, Ryan, or 3 hours.
But something where, if we're talking with coffee people or industry friends that aren't into matcha, and they were like, hey guys, like, what's the deal? Like, where is matcha? Where did it come from? What's the status quo? And where do you think it's going to go in the future? This is sort of our response to a question like
All right. So where do we start?
Yeah, so let's start at the very beginning. One of the interesting things about tea in general is that there is very little dispute about the cultural origins of this plant, of this product. Basically, the only country that holds any claim to being the first people to cultivate tea are in China and Chinese people. Unlike the coffee world, where there's a little bit of debate between Yemen and Ethiopia. And supposedly the scientific evidence shows that it was first discovered and naturally growing in Ethiopia. But then in the very, very early days, no one was really cultivating it to make it into what we know as coffee now, until some Arab people brought it to Yemen and planted it there, and were really the first people to do actually any real coffee cultivation. So it's a little bit more of a complex history, but within the case of tea, it's pretty much undisputed. Except for a few crazy people in Korea who claim that tea has always been there, that tea is a Chinese product and was first cultivated by Chinese people.
Well, a very unpopular idea even in Korea too, as we study under a few Korean tea ceremony masters. But yeah, you're totally right. Not only culturally, but also biologically, that many proofs exist for tea to being first cultivated and consumed in Yunnan. And even to this date, you can still find a lot of the specimens that kind of lies in between, completely wild tea before it got domesticized, and semi-wild, and wild Camellia sinensis. Those are very different things. For some of the cousins that fall into the similar family that were not domesticized, those are actually semi or very poisonous. They're still growing in the wild in Yunnan, along with all the tea bushes that are getting harvested. Very interesting to visit those places with the locals when I was in Yunnan. They
Oh,
look very different in a way that the size is those really like wild cousins of Camellia sinensis are huge, but the leaves are very similar. So I can almost cannot tell the difference between a Camellia sinensis and their wild cousins. But the locals told me that some of them can be processed into tea and is drinkable. And some of them are just really poisonous and will make you very dizzy and very sick. So
mm,
very, very interesting to see them in person.
yeah. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, matcha comes from a plant called Camellia sinensis, which was originally discovered, grown, cultivated, and is a natural part of the forest in southwestern China. And one of the first things you learn about in any tea education is that all tea needs to come from the genus and species Camellia sinensis. And in a previous recording, we said that's about 99% true, which leads to an interesting question. What's the other 1%? And it's exactly what Zongjun was talking about. There are other species, camellia species, that are very similar to tea. So if you go to some of the very Yunnan-focused vendors that sell tea, they have something called Camellia thaliensis, is one of the other common species. It's basically tea and processed into things like pu'er and some other things. So there's some other camellia varieties. Technically, that's the wrong way of putting it. There's some other camellia species, genus Camellia, and then various other species from Sinensis to Taliensis and a few others that are edible, some are poisonous, and they all originate in southwestern China. And of course, these plants are part of the forest. They don't know the boundaries. So, part of those forests extended into Myanmar and Laos and into northern parts of Thailand, where a lot of tea gets processed. And actually, a lot of it gets smuggled across the border, especially as pu'er prices in China have gotten very high, and where that stuff doesn't get even labeled as originating from that place. And most of it gets smuggled to a city in Yunnan called Sichuanbana, more than the pu'er traders buy it and blend it. So we've talked about sort of tea laundering within the case of China and Japan for matcha, but it's also happening where people want to create something that is what people think of as a Chinese product in a very different part of the tea world.
The time all with all kinds of teas, not just in matcha, but we see that in pu'er. We see that in longjing, which is another very expensive Chinese green tea that is cultivated and processed in Hangzhou, and a lot of these regions in Sichuan and Guizhou supplies all of these famous production area and get turned into these much more expensive tea by the end of the day. We kind of see that within Japan too, like Kagoshima and goes supplies all the way into Uji proper and gets processed.
You just got to import the aracha into to Kyoto Prefecture, and boom, you got ujicha.
Yeah, same.
Same, same. It's a big problem in the tea world. So anyway, the origins of matcha's past are in southwestern China, where then tea eventually spread to the rest of the world. At least the Chinese varietals did. But the earliest tea cultivation was done in China, and then later spread through Zen Buddhism to Korea and to Japan. And the earliest documentation of tea moving to Japan, I believe, is in the Tang Dynasty, which is around 1,000 years ago. But it didn't really stick in any meaningful way until a monk named Eisai, who you can read all about online, Buddhist monk studying Buddhism in China, brought it back um, to Japan, where then it really stuck, and he's kind of considered one of the godfathers of Japanese
Yeah,
tea,
yeah.
bringing over those tea seeds.
Yeah, there were predecessors of SI in the past trying to bring tea into Japan from China. But he was the only one that really made the bush and the culture of drinking it took roots within Japan. So that's, I think, around Song Dynasty.
Yeah, during the Song Dynasty. So, Zongjun, before we talk more about the spread of tea throughout East Asia and the move of what was essentially Song Dynasty mocha into Japan, let's talk about the mythical origin stories for tea. So, if you learn anything about tea history, typically you encounter two origin stories for the way how tea was discovered. Do you want to recount the tale of the mythical Emperor Shennong and his discovery of tea?
But yeah, Shenong, wow. It's basically not a real person, but let's treat him as a real person for the sake of this story. But he's one of the mythical, legendary emperor of China thousands of years ago, and basically had this vision and mission of trying all kinds of vegetations that were native to China at the time to test their effects and compile them into knowledge and educate his people. And when he was on this mission of finding all of the medicinal and agricultural effect of all these vegetations, he oftentimes run into poisonous ones and got very sick. And one day he ended up trying this this leaf coming from this tree, and all of a sudden all of his illness and pain went away. It's really a panacea at the time for him, and he gave very high praise to this vegetation and what is to be understood nowadays as tea.
Tea as a cure-all goes all the way back to the mythical origins of its discovery.
Yes. The OG snake oil.
Did Shennong lose 20 pounds after he started drinking it every day?
Oh yeah, he doesn't need to eat anymore actually. But yeah, that's one of the very trustworthy, credible origin story of tea that goes all the way back. The other one, I think, is more credible. I'll let you tell the story.
The other origin story, competing origin story, is much more realistic, I think, where Bodhidharma, the guy who brought Buddhism from India to China, was said to have been meditating in a cave. He was so upset he fell asleep. So he was so upset with himself for falling asleep that he ripped off his eyelids, and that where his eyelids landed, the first tea trees grew. And thus we are all drinking plants that are descendant from Bodhidharma's eyelids.
Wow.
Much more likely.
Wow, it's almost like the Christian story of the bread turning into Jesus, God's flesh.
That's
Very
that's an interesting parallel.
very interesting. But that's the other story that's far more trustworthy, in my opinion, than the panacea of Shenno.
Yeah, so those are the two origin stories, and basically tea is undisputedly Chinese. And then, as I said, it spread to other parts of East Asia in the Tang and Song dynasties, respectively, to Korea and Japan, mostly through the spread of Zen Buddhism, where Buddhist monks traveled to China to go to temples to learn, kind of discovered this new wonderful plant, brought it back with them. So that's approximately how that happened and spread. So, Sam, let's pivot to a little bit of Chinese tea history, which is important to contextualize matcha and its origins. So, can you add a little color about what tea was like and how it was served in the Tang Dynasty and then in the subsequent dynasty, the Song, afterwards?
Yeah, for sure. So tea was actually consumed, and there were very early archaeological discoveries of tea being compressed into cake forms, all the way back to the Han Dynasty, which is almost 2,000 years ago. And the exact way of consuming tea at the time was largely unknown. But there are descriptions of how people consume tea in Tang Dynasty, which is 1,000 years after the Han Dynasty. It's a long time. But tea got consumed along the way too. But there were too few archaeological proofs and records of how exactly, or if there's any ceremonial ways related to that. At Tang Dynasty, people still consume cake teas. Tea are compressed into this form of they call it Longtuan Fengbing. So the cake of phoenix and the dough of dragons. So they're basically either in a cake form or in a dough form, and they will be sealed a pattern of phoenix or a dragon on top of it as tribute to the monarchs. And it was around the Tang Dynasty that people started to consume tea in a more fragmented form in boiled water. It's almost drinking a soup. So they have a giant pot of boiled water. They take some pieces, chunks off from the cake or the dough, and then they will roast the chunk on top of a charcoal fire to kind of revitalize the fragrance and the flavor of the tea. And then they put it into a wheel grinder, and then they grind them into smaller chips. And then they toss the chips into the giant boiling pot along with gingers and a bunch of other spice, and then they drink the soup. So it's more like a soup at the time than the tea that we are familiar with nowadays. And that was how people consumed tea back in Tang Dynasty. And in the Song Dynasty, the way is much more elaborate. So people are starting to form this single origin, single ingredient concept that they are starting to consume tea on itself without other spice and other ingredients in the soup. So tea was largely processed the same. It's still being compressed, and then they would grind the compressed tea into a much finer powder in a stone grinder. So what we call ishiyusu in Japanese. It's called shijiu in Chinese. But the Chinese character, the kanji, is the same. And they would grind them into much finer powder, and then they will whisk it in a tea bowl with a much paler, whiter color compared to today's matcha. So a lot of the theories were suggesting that the Song Dynasty matcha powder tea is much closer to today's white tea, baicha, versus a Japanese or matcha or green tea. So people at the time, usually the monarchs and the literatis, they would do this very interesting competition. They call it doucha, tea competition or tea battles, where they would gather together and then they would try to whisk the tea so that it will form the thickest foam and then they compete on whose foam lasts the longest. And sometimes they will use calligraphy brushes or their fingers to try to do calligraphy on the foam. And there is this very famous artist at the time who can write an entire poetry on a very small table with very thick foam. And it was considered to be a celebrity at the time. So
Original latte art throwdown.
original latte art. Very true, very true. Although they don't add milk, but they do compete by the foam. And that's how people enjoy mocha or Song Dynasty matcha back in the days. And then tea got introduced into Japan around the same period of time. But in China, something big really happened. So it was the downfall of Song Dynasty because of the Mongolian invasion. But the Mongolian dynasty only lasted for 88 years. So it did some damage to the Chinese culture, but a lot of the habits are largely still preserved. But at the downfall of the Mongol dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, this very interesting guy prevailed amongst all of the warlords. Zhu Yuanzhang, or the first emperor of Ming dynasty. He was a peasant, not really a peasant. He was a beggar. He was like from the lowest possible, like social hierarchy at the time, and he had seen the worst out of how people got treated by the society elites at the time in China, by the Han people themselves, and also by the Mongols. So relating back to tea culture, so he really had some pretty iron-fisted policy against overconsumption and elitism in China when he took the throne to
Mm.
become the first emperor of Ming Dynasty. And one of the target was tea. So manufacture of mocha, very similar to early days and even nowadays of how people manufacture matcha in Japan, was very laborious, very tedious, very time consuming. And it was all these people, these farmers, peasants, workers, making something that they themselves are not able to afford. It's reserved for the top of the society, for the elites, for the monarchs. And Zhu Yuanzhang, the first emperor of Ming Dynasty, hated that. Like he hates the idea of overworking and exploiting the lower class, and he hates it so much that he essentially banned the manufacture of mocha in China. And from Ming Dynasty, mocha completely disappeared for hundreds of years in China. So it was banned, and loose leaf tea became the mainstream. But luckily or unluckily, the culture got introduced into Japan. Luckily, it was preserved in Japan. Unluckily, the same kind of tedious and laborious work and culture got preserved and got thrown to the Japanese people. And it was basically the same story. It was a product reserved for the warlords, the monarchs, and the literatis. But on the other hand, luckily, the very reason that we can still enjoy this beverage to this day, we got to thank the Japanese that they helped to preserve this culture. Unlike the Tang Dynasty tea ginger 5-spice soup that we will never know what the taste of those beverages are. We can still have some sense of what matcha or mocha tastes like to this day.
Yeah. So just to do a quick compare and contrast moment between mocha and modern matcha. Actually, before I'll do that, I will say that the only reason that the majority of the people listening to this podcast can drink and try matcha is because of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Matcha is so insanely laborious. And now that we're learning quite a bit more about the ins and outs of matcha production, it is so incredibly energy intensive from like a physics point of view, the amount of heat that you need, the amount of energy that you need to keep everything cold and to mill it. It is like probably from a carbon footprint perspective, one of the worst types of decultivation, at least in its processing.
Yeah, Zhu Yuanzhang had a point.
Not even to mention the labor requirements to do the type of labor before any type of mechanization. So mocha and matcha until the Industrial Revolution were not in every man's tea. It was really an elite culture. And a lot of these stories that are told within China Yu cultural tea contexts are probably more vanity than substance about the types of people that were enjoying tea at the time and who could actually have afforded it. It's very nice that they have a very inclusive spirit, but the historical realities were probably that you had to have a fair bit of money to enjoy it. And put it quite frankly, even today, you have to have a fair amount of money to enjoy it. It's still expensive, but at least it's accessible. But to compare and contrast Song Dynasty mocha and matcha, some people will say, and actually, Mark from Oika recorded a reel, his hot take, and he said his hot take was that matcha is Japanese and not Chinese. And I actually totally agree with his argument, is that what we know of and think of as matcha today bears very little resemblance to what mocha was and how it was processed. So back in Song Dynasty, no one was shade growing their tea, at least not intentionally, and they were not processing it the same way, although they were steaming it, but it was not, this very green, would not have been this very green color. It's been pretty well documented that it was a very white foam. So there's clearly some very different types of processing. So the major innovations which make matcha, give it its physical characteristics and flavor characteristics were really refined and invented by the Japanese. So where you draw that line is, up to the audience. So we don't have a stake in that battle, but they were probably very different products. But
Yeah, but
they did share steaming in common, and they were both powdered. So there were suspension of particles, and you were adding water to tea. They shared that step as well.
But Ryan, shading tea in Japan is also fairly new compared to the long history of tea. If you go back to the time of Sinnolikyu, like they were not shading tea at the time. It was really until there's this very interesting, I think it's Portuguese Jesuit in the 17th century who went to Japan that first documented that the tea was being shade grown in Japan. And there are archaeological discovery of some, carbon layers related to rice straw being used in tea gardens that dates back even 100 years earlier than that. But still, that's fairly recent when we're talking about the long history of tea being consumed in Japan in the region.
And just a cool shout out to the research that you were talking about, and some of those discoveries that were made that were potentially dating, or provided some evidence for Honzu rice straw shading 100 years before it was documented by the Portuguese, was discovered in the Okunoyama tea garden from Horishi
Yeah,
Shimeyan, where
yeah, yeah.
that famous cultivar was from, which is super cool. So every time you're drinking Okunoyama cultivar from Horishi Shimeyan, you're actually drinking tea that is genetically descended from that 400-year-old bush in that garden, dating all the way back to that point, which is quite an interesting piece of living legacy. And the fact that you can drink that when buy that retail in Japan for about $25 is so incredibly special. So take an extra moment to enjoy that.
Yeah, it's a piece of living history.
Absolutely. That was a quick compare and contrast. So when tea then entered Japan, it was really cemented into a tea ceremony. And by the way, we're gonna the Japanese tea history part you could write PhD dissertations on. So we're going to give a little more of a faster overview of it, especially since everyone listening probably has heard a lot about it. But in Japan, basically, it was cemented into a ceremony by a guy named Senyorikyu. At the three core schools that are descended from Senyorikyu is a Moto Senkei, Ura Senkei, and Musha Koji Senkei, which are collectively known as the Sen Senkei, that all derived from Senyorikyu, who has many, many things that you can research. Who's famous for promoting the wabi aesthetic and to sort of move away from these very affluent motifs and decorations and tea utensils that were being imported from China at the time, and really created an aesthetic movement, the wabi-sabi, wabi aesthetic. So these three schools are the primary institutions in which tea ceremony has lived and evolved. It's under a leadership system called the Iamoto system. So Iamoto basically means grandmaster, and it's father to son lineage. And after each generational change, they're allowed to make one fundamental change to the ceremony. So it is thus always living and adapting and not completely rigid throughout time. And then you also have all of the samurai schools, and then you also historically have had a lot of people just practicing tea sort of in their own way that were not necessarily ever tied to one of these tea ceremony institutions. Their influence has waxed and waned over the years.
Well, we both had been Omoto Senkei students at some time. I consider some self-belonging to one of the school, Ryan. I don't know about you.
But yeah, well, I mean, we're both, I don't know, but we're not active. We're maybe former Omoto Senkei students. I still have gone to a couple of their gatherings in recent years and still really quite enjoy it, especially as a guest. Um, it's
Much more
being a host is learning to be a host is very challenging. Honestly, from an educational perspective, it is just a fantastic thing to be a competent guest in a tea ceremony, which, by the way, would probably take years of being a properly competent guest to all the manners and formality that's required. But it's a really wonderful cultural thing to experience when you have arrived at that point in your educational journey. It's honestly not for me. I care much more about the product of matcha than the ceremony itself. And so I learned enough to know that it was not definitely not my path. But I certainly appreciate it for the art that it
Yeah, and thank God that this culture still exists today. That really helped to preserve matcha for the longest time. That because right now we have all these demands coming from all corners of the society and all corners of the world consuming this product. But for the longest time, tea ceremony practitioners, tea ceremony schools were the sole buyers of matcha. Thank them that matcha can still exist to this day.
And so this is where we arrive at a very interesting point because we've talked about tea ceremony and the preparation of tea, but we've also talked about the processing of tea. And the processing of tea, I think, is very underappreciated within the broader history and context of Japan. And Mark from Oika said something very interesting that really stuck in my mind was he was describing these rice straw shading techniques, the Hanzu shading techniques, as endangered was the adjective that he used. And I thought, what a really nice, interesting way of putting it. Is that with all this industrialization that allows all of us to drink matcha, is that a lot of the traditional methods that are less efficient are becoming in danger and losing this tradition. And one thing that's very interesting is I think with it, when most people think of Japanese tea, especially in Japan and in the United States, is that there's very little thought historically given to the farmer. I read a book called Making Tea, Making Japan, and the subtext is cultural nationalism in practice. And it's the history of Chanayu and Japanese tea ceremony and how it was used to form the idea of Japaneseness in the modern Japanese nation and culture. And not once, and this is not a criticism, it's more of an observation, in this entire book, did they ever talk about the people who were actually making the tea.
Hmm.
The
Interesting.
title Making Tea, Making Japan, not once, or maybe very briefly, and I had forgotten, but it really was not a topic of this book, were the farmers or the producers of this product,
Huh.
which is a really interesting observation.
It's well, for the longest time, they are largely, I'm just going to be very frank and blunt, the lowest of the social hierarchy of, the tea making chains. Although they're the beginning part, that like they are really the cornerstone and the foundation of why other people can have something to drink. But in terms of social hierarchy, they're really at the bottom for the longest time, and it's really until very recently that social media kind of gave them a mic to have other people hear their voices.
Yeah, it's it's a very weird change. Zongjun, zooming back at around Senya Riku's time, can you talk a little bit about what was the utility of tea ceremony at the time? About the samurai class and a lot of the stories told around tea ceremonies and why the Japanese took this Chinese tradition and made it their own.
Well, that's actually a very interesting angle to understand tea and its historical meaning in different era in Japan. Because in the very beginning, it's just a beverage that people like to consume. And after Sinnoh kind of formalized and ceremonialized the consumption of this beverage into a culture, it kind of became a safe space, a foundation for people, especially the warlords, to have conversations with each other. Because at the time when you enter into a tea room, actually still to this days, you are not allowed to bring any weapons. You need to surrender your sword, your katana outside of the tea room, and then instead you bring a little very cutesy fan as a symbolism of your weapon.
Symbolic.
Yeah, to and then you enter into the tea room. And it was really trying to, prevent these samurais, these warlords from drawing sword against each other during a dispute. Like you still got to come to a agreement or a disagreement at the end of the day, but you need to walk out of the tea room alive. So that was kind of the purpose of a lot of these tea gatherings at the warring state period of Japan. But the purpose definitely changed after the development of Japanese society. It was really a interesting point that the book you've been reading, Ryan, Making Tea, Making Japan, that later on tea ceremony kind of served as a foundation for nation building, for almost a umbrella structure to kind of contain and preserve all of the cultural element that can be described and defined as Japanese and can be used as a reference for Japanese-ness. And tea ceremony kind of served a wonderful umbrella structure for that purpose.
Yeah. It's interesting. Most of us, in studying history, nationalism is a relatively new concept. I believe, especially just to use Europe as an example, Italy was basically a bunch of little fragmented, tiny little regional centers of power. In the early, I think it was in the 1800s at some point, the unifiers that kind of brought Italy together under to one country said, great, we've created Italy. Now we have to create Italians. And very similar stories are true in France and in Germany too. This idea of being German or this idea of being French or Italian is actually a relatively historically new concept. And Japan was definitely not immune from this. So both in the Meiji period and the more modern period, um, uh, a Japanese tea ceremony, tea, matcha, was kind of chosen as this element that totally embodied Japanese-ness. And it really stuck. And it was a really wonderful encapsulation of so many different crafts and arts that it touched. And I'll read a line here from the book. Let me find it.
No worries.
So she writes, what renders the tea ceremony a quintessentially Japanese experience is not its fixity or apartness from the ordinary routines of living, but rather the alternation between the everyday and the exceptional, differentiation and distinction. That is inscribed in the practice. And then she goes on to say, it's in its combination with practice, one reaching out in a self-reinforcing matrix of other items defined as quote unquote Japanese culture, sustain these resonances. For it takes far more than tea, typically ceramics, scrolls, lacquerware, kimonos, tatami, and even kaiseki cuisine, to make a tea ceremony. In the moment-to-moment unfolding of the ritual, the stage, the props, and the scripted roles conspire to create a seamless flow that not only naturalizes a very unnatural conduct, but also momentarily veils the oddness, apartness, and distinctive Japanese of what's going on. So it
Wow.
really is the perfect encapsulation of Japan.
Yeah, that was a very long way of saying, tea ceremony being a almost a gallery of all of these Japanese cultural elements, a very well curated gallery experience for people to experience and learn about Japanese culture, and for Japanese to learn about their own identity.
Yeah, and to make Japanese people, to culturally Japanese people. And they were saying, especially after World War II, in finding and creating a strong sense of national identity, especially in light of the new global world order and all of the internationalization that was happening, creating a new generation of Japanese people to be molded into the cultural standards that they wanted to imbue to that generation, especially in such a conformist society, was very rigidly structured. And Chanoyu was perfect. It taught you how to sit, how to act, your manners. So, for example, within a Japanese tea ceremony, you have to apologize to the person who's going to have their bowl after you. because you're drinking it before them. And you thank the host, and you're taught to respect the wares, and you're taught aesthetic appreciation. So after you drink the matcha, you put the bowl back down into tame, you look left, you look right, you pick it up, but not too far off the floor to examine the bowl, and you can ask questions about it and look at its different aesthetic subtleties and learn to appreciate them. And on top of that, when you learn Japanese tea ceremony, it is incredibly hierarchical and top down. You are told what to do, what to act, how to respond. It's a perfect training ground to create a more conformist society that Japan is famous for. And that's actually one of the biggest critiques of Japanese tea ceremony in contemporary culture today for people who have no interest in learning or studying it.
Yeah, really, a Japanese society in a nutshell, almost.
Yeah. There's a very funny line. Oh, yeah. Here is so part of this book. She did research, kind of talking with everyday normal Japanese people to get their sense, especially people who are not tea people at all, about what they think of Chanayu in Japan. So this is more like a current day matcha, but looking at it from a very like ordinary Japanese person's lens, and to give you a sense of why it might be a dying art. One reason, she writes this, one reason why the practice is so insistently promoted as relaxed in the experienced tourism industry is because, as a representative of the Kyoto Tourism Board put it, quote, tea is a hierarchical world with a strict relationship between teachers and students. Most people nowadays don't want that. They just want to try it out easily, sitting in a tatame room and enjoying a bowl of tea. So, a lot of they recognize this, at least within the tourism boards, and really stress and have done a lot of modifications for foreigners to have a less rigid experience. So there's definitely some self-awareness even within these cultures.
Yeah, I mean, like even within Japan too, as we talk to some of the younger generation in Japan who are Japanese, they don't want to go through this whole process either. In a way, it really becomes this is highly contextual again, a cultural baggage that preventing people to really enjoy matcha as it is just matcha.
Another contemporary criticism of Japanese tea ceremony is the insane value and price of what they would call a lot of the tea dogu or tea utensils, ranging from the chawans, which are tea bowls, or the scoops or the natsumes, can go for really crazy, insane prices. And someone that she interviewed in the book said, you should be able to do it, referring to chanayu, with any sort of utensil, but no one does that now. And there's this idea around stuffiness, around like what can and cannot be used, and there's kind of this accumulation culture of wanting to buy the nicer and more expensive thing within Japanese tea practitioners. And someone that she also interviewed that I really like and got a good laugh of. This is someone she interviewed. They said, "quote People who don't know tea just say without any interest. When you tell them a bamboo scoop costs $10,000, they just say, 'Oh, $10,000.' To this, her mother burst out into laughter and said, 'Yeah, for an oversized ear pick for one of the great Buddha, a statue in Nara, I suppose. Ridiculous.
How dare you call the chashaku a ear pick?
Ear pick for oversized ear pick for the great Buddha.'" And this is a Japanese person saying it. So it's
So he has a pass or she has a pass.
they have a pass. But backing up a little bit in the history, so you have the Sensenkei, you have these three schools, and they have been active. I believe they're on like their 15th and 17th generations now. In the past, on this podcast, I said 14 and 16, but I think there were generational changes since my memory of learning this. And those have always existed, but they weren't always the only way that tea was done in Japan. So, Zongjun, let's back up a bit and talk a little bit about the histories of tea and matcha in the Meiji era as Japan was industrializing from a practitioner's perspective. From the book Making Tea, Making Japan, what was sort of the lay of the land that was going on in around the 1800s?
Yeah, there's a very interesting paragraph that I can just read it from the book that talks about this very topic. So here it goes. Industrialists and politicians were drawn to Chanoyu for many of the same reasons as daimyo and warriors, daimyo being the warlords at the time, had once been. It offered a symbolic link to prior rulers for purposes of legitimating power. a social space for networking with other elites, as I was talking about, like offering a space for the samurais and the daimyo to have conversations with each other without weapons. And continue in the book, and a means for displaying a superior refinement alongside the pleasures of an afternoon of elegant entertainment. Meanwhile, beneath this oligarchy, the school system, always a central forge of national identity, transmitted to the population below a knowledge of tea woven into a distinctively national history. Girls were encouraged to take up tea as a hobby in training for their role as being, good wives and wise mothers. The tea ceremony was not simply a flat symbol, but a lived practice, with bodies conveying its national dissemination. Whether by business leaders or classroom leaders, tea continued to be done. The variously gendered balances of the nationalized result stood in a productive tension. Women's practice transmitted popular understanding of the tea ceremony to households across the nation, while men's tea, often reacting to women's practice, stamped such understandings with the higher legitimacy of status and power. Very interesting.
It is very interesting.
Like the Japanese society in a nutshell, almost the reason why, like we are perceiving Japanese, in a lot of stereotypical way nowadays from a outsider point of view.
And something very interesting in this book that we don't need to quote is apparently to this day, for college entrance exams, one of the topics that you need to know and basically do some brute memorization has to do about the history of Senrikyu.
Mm.
So, like, this is ingrained within every Japanese person, and a lot of people, especially young girls, were encouraged to study it. And part of it really make up the vast majority of the practitioner base today, and to become like good Japanese subjects, basically, and the good wives and wise mothers policy that the government took. So it's really a very long legacy. Why you but mostly see upper to middle class housewives in Japan are the primary practitioner base of these schools, which is interesting. Another thing that this book goes on to tell that leads us to the modern day status quo of matcha and Japanese tea ceremony was used as a means of was kind of chosen as a cultural element to share it with the rest of the world. So, when Japan came to the Paris World Expo over 100 years ago, a tea house was one of the things that they brought when royalty and dignitaries come to Japan. They're served tea in a tea ceremony. It's really has been chosen as this cultural exchange element that's distinctively Japanese that they can share with the rest of the world.
Interesting. It's almost like the Confucius Institute of China, but much more
Yes,
successful.
much more successful than the Confucius Institute, whose branch was recently shut down at Penn State for reasons we won't
And a
talk
number
about
of
here.
other universities.
Different history, not quite as pure as the China Yu cultural spreading. But it's actually interesting. You go back through the history books. There's a really cool photo of Ronald Reagan sitting on a tatame mat with the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, where he took him to his home and made matcha for him. So there's all sorts of these really cool pictures of it being used as this type of element of cultural exchange. So,
Very interesting.
Sam, this leads us to a wonderful segue of the status quo of matcha today and the modern history is I think all of this toxicity around people, especially in the US, accusing others of cultural appropriation and how a lot of traditionalists are not very open to the ideas of innovation or changing, or, people's conservative mindsets. It's always been this way, it should stay this way. Matcha, in so many ways, is just so fundamentally untouchable because it is distinctively wrapped in this Japanese-ness, and it has intentionally been that way for hundreds of years, where it's literally used as a subject to create Japanese
It's
cultured people. A Japanese person that grows up in the States and grows up and away from their original culture is not the same level of, they don't have the Japanese-ness that you would have if you grew up in Japan. The manners, the sensibilities, the aesthetic preferences, etc.
yeah. I mean, like this whole movement of essentially enshrined matcha or tea ceremony into this very elevated status. I think it's what's making anything that related to matcha or tea ceremony so untouchable. I mean, like matcha being just a element of this whole idea. It's really the most controversial side because it, it it really is not no longer part of Japanese exclusively anymore. It's so internationalized nowadays. For people that are still kind of beholding it as part of something that's essentially very Japanese, essentially part of this Japanese-ness narrative, are obviously would feel offended by people repurposing it for other usage. And when they are doing so, they are often getting accused of appropriating this thing.
And just to give this some gravity and for some further context for everyone listening, I don't know if you know this story. So just to further contextualize this and how important matcha and tea ceremonies to the Japanese, that during World War II, the the inheritor of the Urasenke lineage to the Iamoto was part of the Air Force and actually ended up being part of the kamikaze unit during World War II. And it was chosen that he was not going to commit suicide in that way because he was too culturally important to the Japanese nation. So what they had him do is perform tea ceremonies for the kamikaze pilots. So that was sort of their last ceremonial gesture and salute to those pilots. Was they experienced a tea ceremony, had a bowl of matcha, and then went off to die during World War II. So there's an incredible cultural weight and importance behind tea ceremony, which lives on to this day. It's a very interesting story, and actually. He survived and went on to become the Iamoto and is actually one of the greatest spreaders of Japanese culture and messages of peace after the war. He traveled to many, many, many different countries doing all sorts of public demonstrations as Iamoto and has been very praised in talking about his messages for peace and became a very important man within Japanese tea history. So it is very importantly and distinctively Japanese and it has a huge cultural weight behind it to this day, which leads us into this very interesting dilemma into the future. To segue into sort of the contemporary history of matcha, uh, the Industrial Revolution, which brought a lot more mechanization. Obviously, before World War II, you had the invention and discovery of the Haber-Bosch process, it's a chemical process that allows us to fix nitrogen and basically with a lot of energy take hydrogen and nitrogen and create ammonia, which then can be further reacted to create both bombs and industrial fertilizer. So with this industrial fertilizer, you had this mass agriculture boom along with all these new mechanical devices that allow mass agriculture and that very much hit the tea industry, which is now how the majority of the world can even consume matcha, is because of all of the wonderful inventions and the scale of agriculture that happened after the Industrial Revolution. So at one point, the West starts to take a pretty big interest in matcha, and that's actually a pretty more recent history. I've done quite a bit of searching through the New York Times archives looking for early mentions of matcha. There's not very many, and they're rather obscure, but it really didn't start to really become a thing, as far as I can tell, until around the early 2000s in any sense of scale, where you started to see it in cakes and bubble tea stores and ice cream in Starbucks. I believe the first Starbucks in North America to serve a matcha latte was like in 2004, 2005. And a lot of new consumers got exposed to it in countries all over the world, developed a huge love for it. And then basically the market got flooded with a bunch of crap, very industrial stuff. So the term ceremonial grade was invented to kind of distinguish, matcha that was more meant and designed to be put into a cake with a bunch of sugar to help mask the bitterness, and matcha that was meant to be consumed on its own. People started abusing that term, and that's kind of the status quo that we're in now, because there's a lack of regulation around who can use that term. But matcha's become incredibly popular. And at the same time, Japan is literally a dying country from a demographic perspective. The average age of a tea farmer in Shizuoka Prefecture in Japan is, I believe, 67 years old. Very few of those players, or very few of those farmers, have a succession plan. So not only do you see both declining and abandoned tea plantations all over Japan, but you also see this mass consolidation that's happening where larger companies are buying up or leasing property or existing land from farmers. And the statistic is, I think in the 1980s, you had about 200,000 tea farms in Japan. Now it's under 12,000. That's an insane shrinkage. Although you should put an asterisk next to that and recognize 1980s were an incredibly weird time in Japan. Japanese were among the richest country, one of the most rich countries in the world. And, in the late 90s, if you were talking to someone in business or was apparently early career, I've heard all of the management books about how to be a good manager and how to rise through the ranks were all Japanese books. Japanese management, the Toyota way, but definitely not the case today. No one's copying the playbooks of what's happening in Japan anymore. So this decline is natural and expected when you move from a growth economy that's extremely wealthy, that values things, that they'll spend $10,000 on a tea scoop. For sure, they can support so many different farmers across Japan, but it's just not the case today anymore. So you start to see a lot of the rise of the specialty movement, specialty food movement, single origin products, single cultivar products, better movement in the late 90s in the West of wanting to know where your food came from. And you see the rise of specialty coffee, bean to bar chocolate, and then tea, and then eventually spread to matcha, where it was really spearheaded by a bunch of Western people going into Japan, making relationship with Japanese tea farmers, asking more in-depth questions about their product and doing a lot more storytelling and historically created around matcha product positioning that were mostly controlled by large institutionalized blend houses that just gave all of their products some poetic name and that had very close relationship with large institutional buyers or people in powerful positions that had a lot of influence over consumer buyers, such as Iamotos or people who ran temples, for example. So to this day, you go to some of the older traditional blend houses, you see all sorts of products that are endorsed by this school of Chano Yu or this temple or this thing or that thing. Um, and the idea of having matcha being a very consumer focused thing where, you know what you're drinking and to develop a set of complex preferences is a relatively new topic. And the idea of matcha as a specialty product is relatively new, which brings us to approximately the status quo, which where I'd say we're in the early stages of a specialty market where people really want to understand and differentiate matcha products based on the fact that it comes from this leaf that is descended from Bodhidharma's eyelids and all of the nature and nurture processes that can lead to interesting and unique flavors or stories.
Yeah. Wow. We really came through 2,000 years of a journey of this tea leaf, and we are landing to this day of this very interesting, almost a dilemma of matcha being both a very specialty product and a also very legacy product that served two very very different audiences.
And all of the growth is going to lie outside of Japan because it's a demographically dying country. There are fewer, quote unquote, as this book put it, bodies out there symbolically and literally representing Japanese-ness. And it's a very different consumer base. It's your average office worker who's working in tech in Metro Bangkok. It's someone it's an artist walking around Brooklyn, New York. It's someone down in Santiago, Chile that's running an interesting, cool Japanese fusion restaurant. It's a really different mix of people now. And, back in the days in which this was practiced in Japan, any of these practitioners probably could have never imagined that such a diverse group of people would fall in love with this product that came out
Yeah,
of their culture. So,
yeah.
how do we thread this needle? Matcha is both untouchable and very difficult to criticize or improve upon or iterate on, especially from the outside. And certainly within the inside, it's very difficult. In Japan, it's seen as an industry you can't easily break into, particularly because of all of these cultural associations. So, how do we
Well,
go from here?
Well, I would say that's actually not entirely true. It's untouchable outside of Japan and inside of Japan by a group of people holding a very strong narrative, a strong discourse, or holding a authority to define this product, but not necessarily those people who grows and farms matcha, and not necessarily the people who consumes matcha outside of Japan nowadays. And the whole specialty movement kind of bridged the gap between, all of these people, consumers that you were just talking about, Ryan, in all corners of the world enjoying matcha, and the tea farmers in Japan who have been largely omit and kind of disregard by a lot of parties within and outside of Japan. And actually, by talking, in person with all these tea farmers in Uji, in Yamei, in a lot of different parts in Japan, I would say that they are very open-minded and they're very practical, and they really care about the products that they are making, the tea that they are farming, and they are just happy that people are enjoying their creation. They don't necessarily have this, matcha being untouchable, matcha being unchanged kind of mentality. In fact, when we were in Hori Shichimen's retail store, they were like, "Yeah, these tea are great for latte. You should try it. We like matcha latte too." So, like I think that there is going to be a very segmented consumer cohort and narrative going into the future. And I don't think the gap between these two cohorts can be diminished one way or another. But the good news is one cohort is definitely growing than the other one by a very large percentage. And
No doubt.
I think that like the future of matcha really lives, the demand really lives outside of Japan. But for the moment, the production and the manufacture of matcha inside of Japan is still going to be the status quo in the near future, but we don't know. There are many other places outside of Japan that also grows tea. Why not matcha too?
Yeah. Yeah, just like the idea of you have like new world wine, old world wine, very similar concept could be put onto something like matcha. It doesn't necessarily, especially with the global shortage, the producers can't keep up. There's a lot of structural problems in that industry. So, from people in the West, what are some things that we can do to promote the future for matcha that we think is like very constructive? Like, where are we stepping on our own feet as foreigners and as outsiders in the spreading of matcha and this culture to the rest of the world?
I think one thing that will be very valuable or beneficial for us as people outside of Japan is to view matcha as a cultural element and as a product. So, as a cultural element, I think that's where all of these accusations of cultural appropriation becomes relevant, right? Forming your own school of Chanyu outside of Japan as a foreigner, claiming your way is, the way of making tea, would probably be, cultural appropriation. But viewing matcha as a product, finding a usage of it as a beverage or as an ingredient in various way, I think that's something that's outside of the discussion of matcha being a culture. We spent a lot of time talking about matcha as a culture in this episode, but the status quo of matcha today is that it's no longer being tied by one culture. It's imbued into the daily life of many cultures around the world. It has been internationalized, and it's no longer, being bound by tea ceremony in Japan, being confined as part of the Japanese cultural element. But it has been spread across the world. Thanks to Urasenke, thanks to all of these specialty movements or these beverage companies like Starbucks, making delicious beverages using matcha as an ingredient. Matcha has been preached outside of Japan. And one party can no longer hold the narrative or hold the authority to define what matcha is anymore.
I couldn't agree more. There should be a huge separation between matcha as ceremony and matcha as a product. And matcha as a specialty product is certainly not fighting against ceremony in any way. And this
Yeah.
self-policing that's going on around accusing people of cultural appropriation, I think will really inhibit the growth moving forward. It's kind of like is what we discussed in the authenticity trap. You're using accusations of cultural appropriation as a weapon against other people, which can be very non-productive.
Very dangerous.
Especially, it's very commonly used with the reference of race. Like, this guy looks South Asian to me. He has no right to do this stuff. It's like, why is that the first place you go? And the next thing that comes out of some people's mouths is, well, my grandmother's Japanese. And, it's just inviting a fight. I can say, wow, okay, my dad's father, my paternal grandfather is from Korea, but he was born in Pyongyang, which is now North Korea. But at the time, it was actually part of the Japanese Empire. Does that make me Japanese? Like, I don't know. It doesn't give me any more right than anyone else to promote matcha as a specialty product or even matcha ceremony. A lot of my Omoto Senke teachers were white Americans. The racial component to this is so weird to me and very hostile territory. And I think we're really stepping on our own feet.
And the cultural component too. I mean, like if there's anyone or any entity or group of people can claim, other people culturally appropriating this beverage, will actually be the Chinese. Like they invented powder green tea or powder tea in the first place. They just don't drink it or make it anymore. But it's really bothersome that people are so weaponizing this term and using it to attack other people, in a way that honestly, sometimes it's the the party being attacked probably legitimately made a bad product, or it was bad marketing, or it was bad usage of words. But accusing them being cultural appropriation, I think is just far, far, far too severe of a term or of a condition. It's a bad product, but it's not, attacking Japan. It's maybe attacking your stomach at the least, or the worst, but but elevating it to such a strong or severe status, I think it's really unnecessary.
Well, it creates a us versus them mentality. There's
Yeah.
us. We're the ones who are respectful of culture and trying to preserve this, but they're just trying to profit off of it. And there's a thousand different ways you can slice that. But this implicit division of us versus them is not good in the conversations that move us forward. And this conversation's super long and it's not even close to a detailed history. But the future really much depends on everyone not only understanding the past to contextualize everything, but also not endlessly looking backwards either to cast judgment on other people's practices today. It's, matcha is very much now belongs to the world, even though it is distinctly Japanese. But, it's not under anyone's control anymore. Now
Yeah.
that in the same way that chocolate isn't under anyone's control, or just tea in general, or coffee, you have producers, you have blenders, you have people selling it, you have consumers, and it's all super organic now. It's
Yeah.
not this sort of insular beverage that existed in a famously insular culture historically that has all these rules and rigidity about uh, ritualized ceremonial practices.
Well,
People like to.
those stereotypes really came from people who had the voice at the time. Because when we were talking to the farmers, they were happy that matcha was so internationalized. They were like, friends from afar, come and enjoy the tea that we grow, and come and enjoy this beverage with us. And we are happy that you are so curious and want to learn more about the tea that we are farming.
Yeah, and the farmers are the ones who never get talked about.
Yeah,
So, and that's
they did not have a voice back in the days. It's a very much a very recent change that we are seeing right now, thanks to internet and social medias.
thank goodness that's what the West cares about. We care about the farmers and productions and the product itself. So, the specialty matcha movement is really a movement about people, about the farmers, about the product, about the consumers, and creating the best product possible that meets the right consumer preference. And those products have interesting stories to tell from the cultivar, from the production methods, the terroir, all these types of things. It's actually peeling back the layers of the onion. Matcha has all of this superficial vanity and cultural associations with it. And those ceremonies go super deep, don't get me wrong. They have their own like inner parts of the onion. But if you look at matcha itself and you peel back the layers of the onion, what you get at is a really interesting human story, just like any other specialty product. And that's what the specialty matcha movement, which I believe is the future or one of the futures, that will live alongside tea ceremony as matcha continues to be in the future. But I hope in 20, 30 years from now, we're talking about new experimental cultivars or new crazy shading styles. Maybe someone takes a new wavelength of light in a greenhouse, and does some weird shading, but they expose it to, I don't know, 500 nanometer light, and it
Why does
produces
that
some
sound
interesting
familiar?
flavor. There's all sorts of or matcha being grown in new and different terroir and places, by very different group of people, and it's this like rich, thriving, diverse thing that people can love and enjoy and benefit from. That's what we hope the future is.
Yeah. And we are almost talking about, this specialty movement and Channel U as two parallel universe. But I bet they will converge at some point. Naturally, some group of people from, loving drinking matcha from the group of, the specialty movement cohort will inevitably find curious about Chanokyu and about the traditional side of Japanese and tea culture. And I think that's a good thing. And them joining Chanokyu, want to learn more about traditional Japanese culture. I think that's, beneficial for Japan and Japanese culture as a whole too.
The ultimate moment will be when we can get the Iamotos interested in matcha as a specialty product. That could be a very interesting cultural moment for recognizing Japanese tea farmers and the hard work that they do versus some poetically named product that no one knows what they're drinking because they don't have transparent label and no one tells you. That would be the ultimate goal, I think, of these two worlds converging.
And transparent labeled and poetic names doesn't necessarily contradict each other.
Yeah, that either. But
There's really
I-
no reason why these two words won't converge and handshake with each other at the end.
Yeah, I mean, really, if you want to see the traditional players really dominate, just imagine all the blend houses just start giving radically transparent labels. Boom! It's actually going to be a very difficult marketing position then for everyone else focusing on specialty. That would be the
Yeah,
ultimate. When that pendulum swings back to them, will be a very interesting day.
yeah.
That'll be cool to
Well, we are
see.
happy to see that.
Oh yeah, I'd love for that. That'd be very cool. I mean, any matcha brand anywhere. I mean, your primary value is you're bringing the customers. Like they,
Mhm.
although they are getting much more international distribution and awareness than ever before. But really, like everyone who's listening that owns a matcha brand in their country, they know their consumers better than anyone else, and are able to curate and produce and pick things or select product for them in a way that like a Japanese person literally probably couldn't comprehend someone's preferences in Santiago, Chile, or in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, or in Manila in the Philippines. Like they're very different cultures, different preferences, different everything.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. All right. Apologies for the super long and semi unstructured slash structured conversation. Hopefully, with some editing, this wasn't too long.
But I think this is really a self-embodiment of what the future of matcha will look like too. Super fluid. No one can define it.
So, if you enjoyed listening, please consider sharing it with friends, giving us 5 stars on the platform you're listening to, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you in the next episode.